So, my brother's understanding of Portal 2 is a bit different to most. One time he explained to me his belief that Shell's a clone, reasoning that otherwise the continuity between the first game's ending and second's beginning makes no sense. I had second-hand knowledge that Shell's parents were Aperture Science employees, so I told him this. It still fits, he replied. Maybe she was born in a lab, or maybe you're a clone of your original daughter. This was before I came to learn it's actually a popular enough theory that Portal 2's writers made a point of denying it outright. And with that, so died the theory of Shell the clone. Or not. There was a recent article by Craig Stern where he rebutted a fairly common saying that went along the lines of there's no wrong way to interpret a game, on the basis that, well, it's nonsense, no one actually believes it or practices it. I've generally been having these kind of nagging feelings about the nature of interpretation and the communal value of my work coming from that, so for me this article brought all that to the fore. While hammering away at the everything's valid interpretation clause, Stern also went about suggesting some criteria which we can judge any given interpretation's validity. Stern believes, insofar as interpretations serve as descriptive filters of media texts, they ought to account for all relevant parts of the text and so describe a narrative that's coherent. He doesn't exactly say interpretations ought to be this or that, but I think it's clearly implied it's better than an alternative where anything can go, which is the every interpretation is valid method. It's a grand piece. But while I'm wholly on board for calling out the whole no wrong way to interpret a game thing as nonsense, there's a boatload of problems with the solutions Stern suggests for establishing which narratives should be deemed credible, not the least of which is the fact that it hedges impossible demands on us given how no one is omniscient. My overarching question is Stern doubling up his solution as an explanation for how we interpret things in our everyday lives? Is his concept of interpretation standing on its own head and calling it solid ground? These problems are bog standard when it comes to things like this. If the method doesn't hold water at its core when talking about the nature of interpretation, it won't do us much good when talking about the nature of a video game, or the facts of a video game, whatever that means. So Stern approaches interpretation from a perspective that we experience a game, or a text or an object, interpret it, and subsequently relay this interpretation to whoever's around to hear it. The middle step is pivotal. That's what needs to accurately relate to the game question if it hopes to be a valid description of the object. This step encompasses the crux of the interpretive process, sifting an object for meaning and defining a narrative from the remnants. Now, it's all well and good if you're only really concerned with finding out about the object as an objectively existing bundle of ideas and narratives, since you can stop here without a bother in your head. Under this structure, what you interpret is an object, so what you describe in relaying your interpretation is that object. However, if the act of communicating is itself considered a process of interpretation, namely the filtering of ideas into language, what you go on to describe is your idea of the object as it exists in your mind and not the object itself. You need to reprocess your interpretation to find out if it neatly approaches the source material. Except, you've got no way to compare your interpretation of the object against the object as an objectively existing thing to see if your interpretation reads accurately, because in your head you've no concept of what the object as an objectively existing thing is. You still need to figure out what that is, which requires another round of interpretation. Ultimately, attempting to dissolve away the difference between interpretation and the object itself leads to a homunculus regression. Still, this is something I've needed to reconcile within my own criticism in recent years. I've gone to great lengths in the past when writing about one thing or another to stress the importance of the player to the game as co-author to its narratives. The value here is self-discovery through communication with the object, and then self-affirmation in prizing the narrative as born from a part of you. But a community cannot run on this kind of existentialism. Tensions mount between finding value in yourself and overcoming yourself for the benefit of those around you, your family, friends, neighbours, complete strangers, all of whom depend on your contribution to the social sphere in a way that is optimally not entirely self-involved. If everyone insists to live within their own little solipsistic bubble, community and empathy become unreachable. Whereas the ideal existential being is pure carelessness, in your day-to-day life people depend on you for civility and comradeship, as you do on them. In the field of games, this involves offering ground for a mutual understanding of video games and collaborating with other people to explore our experiences together. Everybody's their own idea on how to do this, their own preference of methodology on how to think and talk about the medium. All these methods are themselves representative of someone's inner being, their education, their heritage, identity, and hopes and dreams, which corroborate in the interpretation of media and fly off into the world to butt heads with the being of another person as expressed by a different critical lens. Through these conflicts, each practitioner of a methodology is left to lick their wounds and ponder on what makes their method important, or more appropriately, what makes their perspective, their interpretations, valuable to the people around them. In his article, it looks like Stern's goal for games criticism is the establishment of communal agreeable knowledge on an objective reality. But if you reject the pursuit of a body of valid reference work as a goal, you can sidestep this value paradigm and instead quest for value by envisioning a new model of the validity of interpretations appropriate to whatever feels fulfilling to you. The question, so, is where do you seek value in your enjoyment and interpretation of games? Or, put another way, does it actually matter if Portal 2's writers deny that Shell's a clone? Sure, my brother's not put out in the slightest by the official canon, so long as his own reading improves on it. Fair play. For me, the purpose of games criticism is not so directed towards the establishment of reference materials. My criticism doesn't trade in information as objectively existing knowledge about objectively existing media texts, since it isn't fueled by a desire for increased quantities of communally available data. The problem haunting my writing becomes this: I can either point to something or tell you what it is, but never both, since in the telling, it becomes something different. So, how do I live an existentially fulfilling life at the same time as living conscientiously? Well, what I can do to reconcile these two forces of text and meaning is to produce with my criticism not data or reference work, but folklore, communally existing knowledge that is inseparable from consciousness on a social plane, as extelligence, inverse to intelligence, consciousness on an individual plane. Much like Geist suggests the mindfulness of ideas, extelligence sees ideas and consciousness embodied in cultural artifacts. Portal 2 is one artifact, this video is another. Taken as an account or description, it deals in facts, but taken as set as folklore, it deals in meaning. The value of this comes as I accept the existence of the social world and my place in it, and contribute to it my consciousness, as given any experiences and perspectives representative of a game's narrative through me. In admitting myself as a participant in your world, rather than maintaining we each live in our own distinct bubbles, I accept responsibility for my message appropriate to my failings in the context of it as a socialized text, and me as a socialized person, rather than appropriate to everybody's individual imagination. The text gains substance through the context by which it exists, historical factors, linguistic, cultural, critical, economic, philosophical, granting it weight and relevance as a token of values and experiences communal to people coming from the same places as me. By this it's then opened up to be read by people of different backgrounds as a proverb, flexible but obliging and yielding no more than its own consciousness allows. The power of folklore isn't in its accuracy as factual account of social or personal narratives, nor in its offer of expertise on a moral or historic subject matter, nor even in its clarity of communication. As extelligence, interpretations can be as unbelievable as you'd like, and still carry such insight as to make them invaluable.